Story 1. I was asked how I would reduce the number of states by one. I said give Florida back to Spain. Apparently, the correct answer was to merge two states. This was a meaningless question. Story 2. I was asked what I would do if I had the money to do whatever I wanted. I said art for kids or something. He said, do that, man. Do what you love. Why are you here? I asked, you mean to tell me your dream is being the manager of a dingy little machine shop? He said yes, but he looked mad. I did not get the job. Story 3. Are you planning to become pregnant in the near or distant future? Story 4. I was asked to tell a dirty joke, which made me very uncomfortable. When I was offered a second interview, I politely declined. Story 5. I do not know about unusual, but I had a potential employer ask me about the 8-month gap in my resume. This was in 2021. I am a chef. This was a restaurant, or rather a resort, that was interviewing me. Did you not notice the global shutdown and the collapse of the food service industry? I did not take that job. Story 6. If you died, would you be accepted into heaven, and why? I was 14 at the time and very confused by this question. Also, I did not get hired. Story 7. My interviewer asked me a superhero question and did not know who the tick was. They seemed concerned that I needed no time to think. Story 8. A restaurant owner asked me, if you were to commit a crime, what would you do and why? Story 9. I am an Asian woman, and an Asian man asked me if I like white boys. I picked up my belongings and walked out. Story 10. I was asked once at the very end of an interview as a joke to calculate the sum total of numbers from 1 to 100. Total coincidence, but I had just read a story on Wikipedia the night before about a mathematician named Euler who, when asked during class as a child, answered that correctly. He did not actually calculate the number in his head. Instead, he used a quick heuristic method to determine the total. 0 plus 100 equals 100. 1 plus 99 equals 100. 2 plus 98 equals 100. And so on. I paused for a moment during the interview to make it look like I was thinking, then gave the answer. I do not remember how they reacted, but I was proud of it. It was one of the few times my deep Wikipedia dives actually came in handy. Story 11. It was the strangest interview experience I had ever had. I remember one of the many interviewers asking me to tell him a joke. In hindsight, I wish I had said, this interview, and walked out. By that point, I was not going to accept the job even if they offered it to me. Story 12. If you were an animal, what would you be? I said a house cat. That was probably the wrong answer. Story 13. How have you empowered women and eliminated racism in the workplace? I was 24 years old. I had only worked at a movie theater, Domino's, and an aluminum recycling factory. Story 14. First runner-up. Can I see your portfolio? We do not need a graphic artist, but I love looking at portfolios. Winner. Do you play EverQuest? We play as a company every Wednesday and need another dependable player. Story 15. You ever kill anyone? I was interviewing, and the interviewer noticed I had Marine Corps on my resume. The question was in the same tone as, where did you go to school? The other interviewer became flustered and gave her a significant side glance. I responded with, I did what the mission entailed. I didn't get the job. I thought of lodging a complaint but decided against it. Story 16. The first question about how I interact with difficult personalities was normal. I gave a standard answer about perceptions, differing priorities, and ways to navigate those challenges. The next 4 questions, which became increasingly specific about dealing with difficult people, were unusual. Your company needs a therapist and should consider terminating those 2 tyrants, not hiring a new product line manager. At least then I could understand why the position was vacant. Story 17. If you had 10 whistles and a piece of string, what would you do with them? Story 18. What were your favorite activities and least favorite activities as a child? This was a director-level position at a hydrogen company. It is actually a really interesting question to ask. It also had nothing to do with the job. Story 19. Interviewing at the same school where my partner taught because my school was not good. Everything was going well when one interviewer asked, If you and your husband got divorced, would you continue working at our school? That was surprising. Story 20. Would you like to sit on my knee? This was over 30 years ago. I was petrified. Story 21. Not me, but my husband was once asked, if you were a kitchen gadget, what would you be? He replied, a can opener. He was interviewing for a journalism role. Story 22. What do you think is the hardest part about working with you? That threw me off a bit, but I can respect the question. Story 23. I was asked if I would be interested in the company's 401k plan. I replied, no, I don't think I could run that far. Bobby Lee. Story 24. I work in the telecommunications industry. At one company where I was interviewing for a job, one of the people at the table asked me how I felt about law enforcement officers. I blinked and asked what this had to do with the job. He told me it was just a question he likes to ask. When the main supervisor was walking me through the lobby, he told me Deputy Fife was a former detective and did not like to hire people who do not support law enforcement. Needless to say, I did not accept the job there. Story 25. I have an Asian last name and an obvious wedding band. I am clearly not Asian. The interviewer was noticeably surprised when we met, asked how to pronounce my last name, and then said they had been expecting someone Asian. They asked how I ended up with that last name. I said, they still let women get married in this country. I did not get the job. Story 26. How many coins it would take to fill the room where I was being interviewed. Story 27. Questions I hate are those that have no answer and try to make you reason out a response. For example, how many windows, how many wheels, how many light bulbs? Is there more X than Y? If you could have any job, what would it be? Yours. Story 28. I was recently asked why manhole covers are round and not any other shape. Story 29. The most unique question I got was how many $1 bills it would take to cover the floor in a single layer in this room. It is similar to questions like how many tennis balls it takes to fill a Boeing 747 jet. The correct answer is to use logic to find an answer instead of saying, I do not know 350. Story 30. What is your disability? Who is paying your disability? Your current employer. These are completely unlawful questions. I did not get the job. I filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Story 31. It is a very basic, common question for most interviews and applications, but being asked, why do you want this job? Will always seem strange to me. If someone is applying to a job, they likely are doing so because they need money. They want it because they have to have a job. The company is not special 99% of the time. So why ask this question? It is unnecessary. I agree it can be useful to ask this question in certain circumstances in jobs, but not every job. I have applied to and interviewed for many jobs, and I feel it is highly unnecessary for places like fast food restaurants, general chain stores, and basic retail stores to ask this question because they will probably never get a sincere answer. If it is for a corporation, a higher position than entry level, or a specialty position of any kind, then this question can help set candidates apart or let the interviewer know if someone is fit for the role. However, it does not need to be included in as many applications and interviews as it is. It is unnecessary to make people answer insincerely when they are applying for most low-level jobs simply because they have to. Story 32. I applied to be a hostess at Applebee's in the 2010s. When the manager asked, why did you apply here? I said, it's a great restaurant and has a great atmosphere. The manager then asked, what makes it a great atmosphere? I replied, everyone is welcoming and nice. He asked again, how are they welcoming and nice? I did not get the job because I could not provide any more answers. It was a strange interview. Story 33. I was halfway through a panel interview and doing well when one person, let's call him Tim, asked, okay, so we want to give you a real scenario. Our company has many women getting pregnant. How would you reduce pregnancy? This was such a bizarre question that I thought he was testing my ethics and risk-based mindset. I responded, this sounds like a public relations and human resources nightmare, and I would never risk the company's reputation. I wouldn't touch this subject at all. Tim pressed further. No, seriously. How would you reduce women getting pregnant? I started to get uncomfortable and doubled down, but he became more aggressive. His team lead, who was also on the panel, finally said, "Okay, let's just proceed with the rest of the interview. In the future, Tim, asked the whole question, how would you reduce pregnancy leave?" Both Tim and I changed expressions, him pale and me, after saying, "Oh, well, in that case." His team lead stopped me, and I remember staring daggers and saying, "Thanks, Tim." I did not get called back. Story 34. Not a question so much as a scenario. I was given a specific task to do in AutoCAD. However, I chose to complete it as long as it was done quickly and correctly. I did so, and then was immediately criticized for not doing it the way the interviewer would have. This was also an interview where, as I was being shown around the building, I overheard the two men interviewing me discussing my outfit openly, within earshot of me, in the middle of a warehouse. There were many other red flags at that interview, and I was waiting to be told I was on candid camera. Story 35. Do you think you are desperate enough for this job? I stood up and left the room. They called me back a week later, but I refused the job. Story 36. Can you start immediately? He meant right now. He sat me down at the desk and that was it, a secretarial job. I stayed with that organization for 33 years, and when I left, believe me, that would not have happened. Human resources would have delayed the process for 3 months before offering me the job. Story 37. Not necessarily a particular question I was asked, but I had a Zoom interview where I spent time with a group of 3 potential coworkers for about an hour as they asked me questions. Then I went to another room with 3 more potential coworkers and they also asked me questions. Throughout the interview, I met with about 4 groups of potential coworkers, and they all asked the same questions. To this day, I do not understand the point of it. I answered the same questions 4 different times with 4 different groups of people. I ended up getting offered the job and even asked them about the unusual interview after I was hired, but never received a clear answer as to why candidates have to answer the same questions repeatedly. Story 38. If you could go back in time, who would you talk to and why? Story 39. Not really strange, but funny. The interviewer asked my friend what he would describe as his weaknesses. He said digestive biscuits and leggy blondes. He got the job. Story 40. During an in-person interview with a panel of advertising agency creatives. Advertising agency. What kind of car do you drive? Me. Oh. Do you have an automaker as a client? Agency. No. Me. A dealership? Agency. No. Me. A business-to-business parts supplier? Agency. No. Me. Are you hoping to go after clients in the automotive market? Agency. Well, not really. Me. Maintaining eye contact while silently realizing I do not want to work for these people. Agency. We will be in touch. Story 41. What is your favorite punctuation mark? It was for an editing position. Story 42. Who are you and why are you even here? I was called back for a second interview. Human Resources explicitly told me not to bring a resume. When I sat down with the vice president of the company, he asked for my resume. I explained I was asked not to bring one, and he said, "You weren't asked that by me. So who are you and why are you even here?" He was done with the interview almost immediately. I was 4 months into unemployment. I left crying and contemplated deliberately crashing into a tree at high speed on the way home. Story 43. I was asked by a Disney recruiter if I had all of my teeth. Story 44. Not my interview, but a friend interviewed for a job at a veterinarian's office, and she was asked to spell diarrhea as one of the questions. Story 45. I was asked what street the Griffins live on in Family Guy. I couldn't be part of the family if I didn't know. Story 46. If you were an animal, what would you be and why? I said cockroach because they thrive everywhere, eat anything, and cannot be eliminated. The interviewer was horrified. I guess he thought I would say something cliché like lion or eagle. Story 47. Do you think you could work with this technician? The manager pointed to the service technician sitting next to him during the interview. Story 48. 1,987 interview questions. Did your husband give you permission to get a job? Do you plan on becoming pregnant again? Are you part Japanese? Story 49. Interviewing for a full-stack developer role, I was asked to explain how to brew a cup of coffee to someone who had never done it. The idea was to see how I approach tasks and explain concepts, whether detailed and methodical or with broad strokes. I stumbled a lot because I said my approach would change greatly depending on who I am speaking to and how they would best comprehend. They appreciated that consideration. Story 50. I was asked during a help desk interview. An important client, while traveling, wanted to order dinner but his internet was out. How would you start troubleshooting? The correct answer was that I was supposed to take his dinner order and call it in for him. I did not get or want that job. Story 51. I was once asked, what are 5 ways to use a brick? Fortunately, I had common sense enough to know not to answer with anything illegal. This was for a sales position at Best Buy. Story 52. How I voted because, and I quote, a socialist wouldn't be happy in a capitalist environment. It was for the Yorkshire Building Society in 1987 before you assume it was some insane Donald Trump supporter. Ironically, building societies were a very socialist construct. Damn, I wish I had thought to say that back to him. Story 53. I interviewed for a job that required 75% travel. They directly asked me about my personal life and if it would be conducive to being on the road all the time, for example, if I have a dating life, a partner, or children. Seriously, do you really think I would apply for this job if I did not think I could do it? I do not see how that is any of your business. Story 54. If you were given an elephant, what would you do with it? Apparently, selling it was the wrong answer. Story 55. How do you feel about having to put restraints on students? My answer is not too good. Sorry, I have to go. I am late for my next interview. Story 56. Not the actual interview, but had to take a polygraph during the hiring process. Have you ever had sexual contact with an animal? Story 57. If you were an animal, what animal would you be and why? Story 58. If you could be an animal, what would you be and why? It was for a marketing position. Story 59. Interviewed at Peterbilt dealership for a mechanic position. I was asked if I could be any animal, what would I be and why? Story 60. If you sold paperclips and we were a paperless company, how would you sell them to us? This was for a bank position, and I said buy the color-coded ones to organize snacks in the break room. Apparently, I was the only candidate who did not say to clean under your nails and ears, and I got the job. Story 61. Went to work for a veterinary clinic. The interview was going well until she asked me how I work under pressure. I asked her to describe a situation for me. She asked, you know doctors throwing things and screaming, but not at you. What? I left that interview very quickly. Why would anyone in their right mind be okay with that? Story 62. Estimate the number of planes flying over the United States right now. That is the sole question for a 30-minute consulting case interview. They want to see how you problem solve under pressure. There is no right answer. It is all about whether they like your approach. I made several logical assumptions and arrived at a very small number. I received credit for recognizing that this was obviously not correct and for identifying what I might want to validate and change. A classmate had the same interview and said his assumptions produced a very large number. Both of our logics were sound and we each received offers. He accepted the job and I did not. Story 63. Here are a few good questions from my last interviews. 1. If you were to go on vacation, where would you go? 2. What is your political standpoint for this election? 3. Outside of work, what are your go-to meals? What do any of these have to do with work? Also, I get asked what my hobbies are. Once again, what do any of them have to do with work? Note, this was before I got my current job. Story 64. I was asked if I would be willing to break my non-compete agreement with my previous employer. I said no. My previous employer was my father. How am I going to get away with that? Story 65. What are your worst qualities that you think might prevent you from getting this job? I was pretty baffled. I couldn't think of anything specific, nor did I really want to speak negatively about myself, so I gave a general answer. I like to listen to music while I work. I didn't really do much of that, though, but they insisted that it had to be something. Story 66. I went to a job fair for graduates of United States Service Academies. There was a cocktail reception the night before where you could chat with some of the prospective employers. I spent some time talking to a representative from a major corporation who was looking to hire people for defense-related work in the field of nuclear energy, reactors not weapons. When I got into the interview with him the next day, we were allotted 30 minutes. His first question was, "What do you want to talk about for the next half hour? You got the job last night at the reception." Story 67. I interviewed with Navy Federal Credit Union in 2016. The question that stands out to me was, how would you feel if you have a day at work so bad that you go home and cry? The place is a meat grinder call center, so I understand, but that's a pretty poor question, in my opinion. They might as well have said, "Just so you know, this job is so brutal, we have such high turnover. You will probably go home and cry on most days." Story 68. What kind of lifestyle do you want? I said I didn't want to work at 3:30 a.m. anymore. The supervisors laughed. It was an 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. job, so my answer was not a problem. Story 69. What are you looking at that's more important than this interview? I was sitting for a job interview in the manager's office on the first floor. Suddenly, I heard screeching tires and an explosion. About 50 yards away from the window, there was a 4-car pileup that included a city bus. Instinctively, I flinched and looked out the window. The interviewer became angry that I diverted my attention. After the interview concluded, I drove no more than 2 miles before the recruiter called me excitedly to say they wanted me back for a second interview. No, thank you. The company later went under due to charges of fraud and operating as a Ponzi scheme. Story 70. I had an interview where I was asked the same standard interview questions 3 times in a row. I was beside myself wondering what the situation was. As I previously stated, insert response. Story 71. How old are you? I did not get the job because I looked too young. Story 72. My wife was asked, "Are you engaged or married? And do you have any allergies?" This was for a pharmacist position. Story 73. I was interviewing for a recruiting position, and the owner of the company asked me a question that started with, "If you met a genie." I did not get the job, and I am not upset about that. Story 74. What is the difference between a male engineer and a female engineer? This question came up during my first job interview after college. Story 75. Would you rather be a sock or a shoe? This was for an entry-level accounting job at a dialysis center. This was question number 1, and frankly, it threw me in a loop for the whole interview. What a strange question. Story 76. How would you explain the internet to someone from the 1500s? This is definitely one of those questions designed to throw you off your game. I found it interesting, and the interviewer was proud when I admitted I was taken aback before stumbling through an acceptable answer. Story 77. If I were to go down and see what was in your car, what would I find? Story 78. This was in a pre-employment questionnaire, not an interview. Do you wear fresh underclothes daily? Story 79. What is the square root of 20,736? Why would you ask that? I mean, it was a drafting job, so engineering related, but what a strange question to ask in an interview. Story 80. I was asked what I like to do on the weekends because they were a family and spent a lot of time together outside of work. Story 81. Just the other day, I was asked what my favorite superhero was. A few minutes earlier, they had asked me to name the book that changed Steve Jobs' life. Needless to say, I left without saying a word. Story 82. If I were single, married, or seeing someone, how exactly is that relevant to the job? Story 83. What would you do if you won the lottery? It was for a non-profit organization, so they wanted me to say that I would spend the money on their cause. 2 people at the company asked me the same question in 2 different interviews. Story 84. I am former military, and during an interview, I was asked if I had post-traumatic stress disorder. I laughed at the person, thinking maybe he was military and it was some sort of weird joke. He was not prior military and was completely serious. Story 85. What animal would you be? Felt like I was being interviewed by a preschool teacher. Story 86. Whether I have a boyfriend and if he will allow me to work late. When I got offended, he went on a rant about how it is difficult to employ women because their husbands or families do not want them to work late. Bullet dodged. Story 87. Can you drive a forklift? The job was as information technology manager for a supermarket chain. They were expecting a strike and wanted to know what jobs managers could fill. The answer was yes, but when they told me why, I said there was no way I would ever cross a picket line. Story 88. How well I perform under pressure. I had an intake with a lead developer and a Scrum Master. The Scrum Master asked me this while the developer asked a bunch of technical questions. They did not have a clear structure and fired off questions at random, which was unsettling. At the time, I was a junior new to the technology. Although I had some experience as a developer, it was my first time using this technology. I asked what they expected of the role, and the developer said it was mostly about learning as much as possible and growing into the function. Why would they ask how I perform under pressure? I answered that I do not really experience pressure much, which might sound unusual. They later rejected me because of my lack of knowledge of the technology. I had a horrible time in that interview and honestly did not understand their approach. I work in consultancy, and a few months later I joined the same company in a different team. I kept having to see them, which was weird. I have received a lot of positive feedback working there. When I expressed my desire to leave, they did their best to keep me on. This makes me wonder why I was rejected the first time and why that interview was so jarring. Story 89. It was in Texas. What church do you attend? I am pretty sure that is not legal. Story 90. I was asked if I have any children. I was 5 months pregnant at the time. It is not a strange question, but her tone suggested, we do not want to hire parents. Story 91. I was a part-time employee at one company interviewing for a similar full-time position at another. The entire interview consisted of the interviewers asking about the budget and operations of areas outside my department, which was unusual. Story 92. Why do you want to work for us? Because earning money pays the bills. Story 93. It wasn't a question but a statement. The person told me, an extraordinarily pale blonde, "Oh, I just saw your name and assumed you were a black girl. My name is Natalie." I was just like, "Oh, really? Yeah, I'm white, nearly the same shade as a piece of computer paper." It was odd. Story 94. Was I married? They were absolutely trying to find out if I was gay or straight. This was in the early 1990s. I am gay. I told them that their question was illegal and none of their business. The interview stopped at that point. Story 95. How long would you be willing to work with no pay? It was a technology startup that was experiencing difficult times, and the chief technology officer was having a very frank conversation with me. I appreciated the honesty, but that was a hard no from me. I lost some good friends by turning down the offer. Story 96. I went to an interview with a company where my friend worked. Before the interview, he told me a question that the interviewer always asked. It was a chunk of C++ code and some class diagrams. My friend gave me the answer. When I got there, the interviewer asked me a different question, vaguely related to what my friend told me. I tried to adapt my friend's answer to fit the question but could not. I should have relied on my own experience and knowledge. I did not get the job but was offered a contract at the company, which I accepted. A few days before the contract ended, the startup folded. It was better that I got the higher-paying contract for a few months than to get the job and be laid off a few months later. Story 97. Explain to me how you would estimate the global annual demand for t-shirts. Story 98. If you were a member of a circus troupe, which member would you be? Story 99. Design a parking garage. It was a software engineering interview. Story 100. What color is Tuesday? Apparently, it was some psychological thing that is supposed to throw you off or confuse you, but I just said blue. Story 101. Compare Mighty Special Grab Hospital Hunt Market Roll Meeting Observation. Story 102. Had a group interview at a chiropractor's office years ago. Fallout shelter scenario question. Here is a list of people and their professions. You can only pick 10 people from this list. Who do you pick? One professional is a chiropractor. All of us picked the chiropractor as one of the 10 people. This was for a reception position, and I am glad I did not get a callback. Story 103. Do you or have you ever manually stimulated caged animals for artificial insemination? It was meant as an off-track icebreaker and vibe check when I was applying for a position with a nonprofit organization. My answer was no. I got the job. Story 104. Craziest interview question. If you were a kitchen appliance, what would you be and why? It is a very unusual question, but the intention is to gain creative insight. Are you a blender or a toaster? What does that say about the qualities you bring? Story 105. I was in the car business. A favorite interview question of theirs was, if you had a rock, what would you do with it? Story 106. I was asked if I follow the recipe when cooking and if I prefer coffee or tea. When I responded with coffee, the interviewer said that was the right answer because everyone in the office drinks coffee only. She turned out to be a horrible toxic boss. Story 107. What is your favorite kind of cheese? I have actually asked this question every time I interview someone. Story 108. I was in my early 20s. I am 50 now. A minimum wage job that paid $4.25 an hour asked me my age. I said you cannot ask that in a job interview. I did not get the job. They cannot ask that. Story 109. I was asked which Disney princess I would be. I just stopped the interview and left. Story 110. Buddy asked me about my abilities. I was interviewing to be manager of a bowling alley. Story 111. How would I survive a zombie apocalypse? I knew then this would not be a company I wanted to be a part of. Story 112. At a teacher interview, I was asked a strangely suspicious question about whether I would be willing to go along with the administration department's decision if there was a situation at the school where I felt something was handled incorrectly. The question was vague, and when I tried to get them to be more specific, they refused. I asked if this was based on experience, and they said no, it was purely hypothetical. I said I would do what I thought was morally and legally correct in a situation and hoped the education system would also share similar goals and values. They were not pleased by that. I have no idea what they were looking for. 6 people were at the interview, taking notes on me, quietly staring and not smiling. It was awkward. Story 113. I was laid off work around the pandemic. United Parcel Service was hiring for seasonal package handlers, so I went to the large group orientation. At that point, an official-looking woman and a younger man came in and announced they were in desperate need of managers and asked if anyone was interested. My previous job had been operations manager of a fabrication firm for nearly 10 years. I felt strongly that the managerial role would be a better fit. Plus, I had worked as a package handler before and was familiar with it. Without much thought, I volunteered. To put this in perspective, I would guess there were maybe 50 to 70 applicants in the room. Of these, I was one of only 3 who stepped forward hoping for a managerial role. One was a woman about my age with her resume in one of those neat presentation binders, this for what she thought would be a package handler job, and the other was a young man who looked no older than 21. To cut to the chase, they interviewed us one by one. I don't remember the order. When it was my turn, all 3 of us sat down. The older woman asked, "Do you enjoy yelling at people?" In retrospect, maybe I should have seen where she was going. Instinctively, I said no. I had just spent years in a physically and emotionally abusive relationship, and my mind immediately went there. Without missing a beat, she said, "This role requires a lot of loud yelling, so I'm not sure this would be the best fit for you." I thought she was joking, so I laughed and began to explain what I meant. That's not what I meant. I don't like fighting with people. But I wasn't allowed to get more than 3 words out. After that, nothing I said made her reconsider, not even a suggestion to review my resume. She kept saying things like, "Your voice is too quiet," which anyone who knows me would find ridiculous. But her mind was made up. Seeing my obvious disappointment, and I wasn't hiding that I thought they made a hasty, uninformed, and perhaps prejudicial decision, they encouraged me to still apply for the package handler position I had originally come for. You can see what it's like. Maybe work your way up. even though a glance at my resume would have told them I already knew what it was like. We're making calls on Saturday morning at 9. You promise you'll answer. They asked multiple times, wanting to ensure I would answer so I could work my way up as a package handler. Feeling something wrong had happened, I still tried to keep composed and professional, so I agreed. On Saturday morning, I set my alarm and kept my phone nearby starting at 8. 9 no call. 9:15, 9:30, 10 a.m. Still no call. In fact, I never got the call. So, I decided to call them instead, either the next day or the following Monday. The man who had been in the office with the woman interviewer answered. He sounded surprised when I identified myself. I explained I was following up on the package handler position since I'd waited all day Saturday without a call. He gave an unclear excuse about being busy and meant to call me. I said that was fine and asked what was next. He said he would call me the following Saturday with details. I said okay, and we hung up. I was not surprised I never heard from them again, but it still seemed strange. It wasn't like I was dressed unprofessionally or hadn't bathed. No one in that room looked worse than me. I can't help but think this was a no-win scenario. What if I had said, "Yes, I love yelling"? Would they have hired me then? I'm doubtful. Sorry for the long story instead of a quick question. It wasn't my worst interview, not even at United Parcel Service, but it still upsets me to remember it to this day. Story 114. We were at a small company. We asked many questions to understand the personality of each person. The team of 6, as casual as possible, asked a variety of questions. We rotated who asked, but always included a question with humor or about speed. Examples include, what is your favorite Pokemon and why? And Chick-fil-A or Bojangles? Everyone hired gave great answers. Story 115. Would you like to sit on my knee? This was over 30 years ago. I was petrified. Story 116. Final question. Lighthearted, thinking on your feet. What hashtag best describes you? Story 117. You are in a room with a group of preschool children. How do you inspire them? Story 118. How would you survive a zombie apocalypse? When you think about it, this is a good question because the answers given demonstrate people's levels of independence, determination, and resourcefulness. Story 119. How many letters do you think our company sends out in a day? I was applying for a project manager job. Story 120. Without looking at a map, how would you estimate the number of stoplights on the island of Manhattan? Story 121. He wanted to look at my hands. I understand why, but it was still odd. Story 122. What do you normally wear on a daily basis? Like what? Story 123. Have you ever read Thomas Mann? I had an internship at a law firm. Story 124. So, you used to be a welder? Which one of us used to weld, indicating the 4 ladies around the table with me as well. Story 125. In my case, it was not a strange question. During a job interview I had years ago, several times the interviewer said, when you decide to take this job, not if or should you, but when, struck me as very odd, pushy, and desperate. I was offered the job and turned it down. Too many red flags. It turns out they had a very hard time filling the position and have a history of high employee turnover. Bullet dodged. Story 126. I was interviewing for a project manager role in construction, and the managing director suddenly challenged me to sell him the bottle of water I was drinking from. Story 127. You are both going to fart and burp obnoxiously all the time. It was a sort of joke because my friend who got me the job had warned me that he burps and farts constantly during his interview. Story 128. Why do fire trucks back into fire stations? This question was apparently designed to observe how a person thinks. Story 129. Roll Tide or War Eagle? I said War Eagle and got the job. Story 130. It was a group interview, the first of 3, with the second 2 being individual interviews for Magic Mountain. They asked us all to do the chicken dance together. It sounds like an exercise in humiliation, but thinking back on it, it actually made sense. They probably wanted employees who would be goofy and fun to be around for the kids, not employees who were too stuck up or embarrassed to be a little silly. I was a goofy kid and loved doing the chicken dance. I ended up being hired. It was a pretty fun job. Story 131. Do you have childcare? I didn't mention any children, but it caught me off guard and I answered yes. I didn't get the job. Story 132. I was asked this die-hard water jug riddle. Story 133. Tell us how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It was for a game testing job. All the questions leading up to this were thought experiments to see how well I could describe things, but they all related to gameplay or art. Then they asked me a question that I thought I had to use as a metaphor. I was confused. Then the peanut butter and jelly question came up, and I thought it was the same metaphorical thing. So I explained how game testing is like making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember feeling pride in my answer for about 2 seconds. Then I saw the faces of the interviewers, who said, "No, just tell us how to make a regular sandwich. What kind of question is this?" I answered simply, bread, peanut butter, and jelly. What's there to explain? Then the interview ended. They didn't call. Also, they went out of business about a year later. I wonder why. Story 134. Why would you like this job? Because I have bills to pay. But no, a nice normal answer would be, I want a new challenge. Story 135. Was in an interview for an information technology developer role, and a scrum master asked the candidate, "So how is the goat farming going?" Needless to say, the candidate and the other interviewers all gave him a funny look. Evidently, one of the candidates we had reviewed resumes for had raising goats as a hobby, just not the one we were interviewing. Story 136. Years ago, I was asked in an interview to describe my perfect day. I rambled on for what felt like eternity, talking about spending time with family, friends, and trivial things I thought they wanted to hear to get to know me better, while keeping it clean. I didn't get any farther in the process after that, even though I thought everything else went well. I blame my answer for the outcome. I have pondered for years what the correct answer should have been. The best I have ever come up with is that there is no such thing as a perfect day. No matter what happens, it could always be better. Resolving conflicts should have been my focus. Story 137. Not a question, but about 10 minutes in, the interviewer stopped to take a smoke break. I tagged along and we continued outside. They said they were too stressed by their jobs to wait until after the interview was over. Story 138. If you were on a desert island, what 3 things would you take? It was a social work interview. I named 3 things to help me get home. The interviewer thought I should have named things to enjoy a holiday. Story 139. A guy I know was asked, "What would you do if one of the other guys in the truck passed gas?" It was a city job. All of us at the place I worked decided it depended on who it was. For some guys, it is best to open the window and jump out. Story 140. How many square feet of artificial turf are there in the world? Story 141. If you had a budget of £500,000 for a team-building exercise, what would it be? Also, not at an interview but during the process beforehand, what job did the main breadwinner have when you were 14? Very oddly specific. Story 142. Do you have any pets? This question was asked during a call center interview. What does it have to do with a job interview? Story 143. Interview for a position at a nursery. Please tell us your favorite children's nursery rhyme and sing it. Most awkward thing I have done in my life. Story 144. My girlfriend was trying to get me a job at a grocery store where she worked, and they asked me questions like, how long have you known her? What are your intentions with her? Why do you want to work here besides her? It made me very uncomfortable. Needless to say, I did very poorly. Story 145. Years ago, Target used to make people talk as if they were with a psychologist. They asked my friend, "Do you hate your mother or father more?" After hearing that, I decided their culture was not for me. Story 146. If I were okay with being treated badly by the men I would be working with. Story 147. I was asked at a Chipotle interview if I thought it was okay to make friends with customers. I still do not know if it is or is not okay. Story 148. No, the only strange question I dread is, why should we hire you? I don't know. Maybe because you posted a job opening on Indeed and I have the experience and qualifications. That question always seems ridiculous to me. Story 149. Do you have friends? This implies that they will not provide any relocation assistance. Story 150. If you had to work at 6 a.m., how would you wake up? An alarm clock. Then they asked, why do you want to work here? I said, I really don't, and left. Story 151. Why do you want to work for this company? I suppose it may be true sometimes. Story 152. In 1975, I was asked by a male interviewer, are you pregnant? I said, no. He even asked, are you certain? I replied, yes. The man was horrible. I needed that job, so I could not tell him off. About 15 years ago, his name appeared in the obituary. He was living in Florida. I thought, well, he won't be bullying any more women. Story 153. I was asked a hilariously specific question while interviewing for an English teaching job in Japan in 2016. What would you do in a situation where you are in Japan at a drinking party after work with a coworker, and they are drunk and angrily ask how they can trust you if you are American and Donald Trump was elected the president? I replied by saying the choices of a government and country do not necessarily reflect the choices or values of an individual, but I would love to hear more of my coworker's thoughts, and then I cheered my coworker with a beer. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.